Thank you so much for being here tonight, and welcome to tonight's Paula and Alfred Friedlander Forum. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is David Scott, and I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning and Engagement at Congregation Beth Israel. On behalf of our Adult Education Committee, Rosalind Fuchs-Heiken, President of our Board of Trustees, and our entire board and staff of the congregation, we are so excited to welcome several hundred of you to tonight's program. There are guests from all over the Houston area and beyond joining us for this important conversation featuring Eric Ward. I also want to welcome the many hundreds of Jewish educators from around the country who are with us tonight as we conclude this year's ARJE, the Association of Reformed Jewish Educators annual gathering. Welcome to all of you as well, and thank you for being here. Finally, a special thank you to Paula Friedlander for making tonight's event possible. We are so grateful for your leadership and generosity that allows us to hold this event. At this time, I'll turn the program over to our senior rabbi, David Lyon, who will continue with our introductions. You will note that everyone has been muted for this presentation, and if you'd like to submit a question to Mr. Ward, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Rabbi Lyon, welcome to the program.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you. This is an incredibly precious time in our country, and so the timing of our program, though planned many months ago, couldn't be more perfect. Because you are here means that you have a particular interest in the topic and our future that we'll share together. And so I'm especially grateful to all of you and all those who took so much time and effort to plan our exceptional program, with a special note and special thanks to Paula Friedlander, who, in honor of Paula and Alfred Friedlander together, her dear late husband, a past president of our congregation, Paula saw fit to honor their strength, which they demonstrated together for so many years in our congregation and community, champions of social justice, of fairness and equality. And so we're grateful that we can share this beautiful program with you because of Paula's foresight and generosity. Thank you, Paula, so very much, my friend, my congregant, and a dear supporter of all things we hold dear. And so I'd like to begin by introducing Mark Tobin, the Regional Director of ADL Southwest, and Dina Marks, the Senior Associate Director of ADL Southwest. Here in Houston and in the region, ADL is a profound contributor to all that we champion for the sake of all who wish for the same rights and privileges that we live by each day and hope to have for us and for all who are touched by our lives in the future. So sit back, relax, take notes, prepare your questions, and Mark and Dina, thank you for leading our program this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Lyon, and thank you, congregation Beth Israel, for working with us on this really important program. I also want to thank David Scott for partnering with us as well. Rabbi Lyon serves ably on ADL's Coalition for Mutual Respect, and he was recently chosen by Reverend William Lawson and Archbishop Fiorenza to continue the good works of the three amigos, following in the footsteps of his mentor, Rabbi Sam Karf of blessed memory. Founded in 1913, ADL's timeless mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. We relentlessly fight anti-Semitism and all forms of hate in communities across the globe. Today, that includes confronting anti-Semitism on the left and the right, in person and online. It means working to break down the walls that hold up systemic racism and striving for racial equity. We advocate for unfettered and safe access to the ballot box and for helping our nation cope with the pandemic, untethered by hateful conspiracy theories and racial and bigoted assaults. As evident most recently following the seditious riot at the US Capitol, we pursue with every ounce of our ability and expertise the protection of our nation's democracy, whether through our Center on Extremism, whose groundbreaking work helps monitor and identify extremists of all stripes, or our Center for Technology and Society, which has played a key role in removing insurrectionist content from various platforms. ADL has and will continue to be in the middle of the efforts to ensure a peaceful transition and contain violent domestic extremism. Please, if you encounter any form of hate in person or online, don't hesitate to file a report at www.adl.org, report an incident. And if you'd like to learn more about our work, please email southwest@adl.org, or you can sign up at southwest.adl.org/contact. Our partnership with Congregation Beth Israel doesn't end tonight. A week from tonight, Tuesday, the 19th at 6:30, we'll be having, for the first 20 congregants who register via Beth Israel's website, a seminar on becoming an ally against prejudice and hate. Then on Sunday, February 21st at 6:30, we'll have our Words to Action program, Standing Up Against Anti-Semitism, also available to the first 20 congregants who register on the website as well. I'd like to thank on the ADL side, Margie Levin, ADL's Assistant Regional Director, for her work in putting together tonight's program. And now I'd like to introduce the moderator for tonight, ADL Assistant Southwest Senior Associate Director, Dina Marks. Dina has worked for ADL since 1999. Her responsibilities include communications, law enforcement, including training, and incident management. She staffs the International Affairs Committee and the Committee on Law Enforcement, Extremism, and Anti-Semitism. Prior to joining ADL in 1999, Dina spent 21 years in television news. Dina is also co-chair of Beth Israel's Justice Committee. Dina, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We're very lucky to have Eric K. Ward with us tonight. He's Executive Director of the Western State Center, a Senior Fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and a Senior Advisor with Race Forward. And he's been a leader in community organizing and philanthropy for more than 30 years. He's a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. So he's uniquely positioned to talk about what happened at the US Capitol last Wednesday and help us figure out ways to respond. In fact, he's given more than a dozen interviews since January 6th to media outlets, including the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, and the Associated Press. He also is the author of multiple written works, including Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism, which he may talk about tonight. I know you'd much rather hear from him than from me, so let's make that happen. Welcome, Eric Ward.
It's such a pleasure to be with everyone tonight. I, especially want to thank my friends and colleagues at the Anti-Defamation League. It has been a great support to work with the ADL and our colleagues there over the last 4 years, as we have worked side by side to educate communities, to equip leaders to respond to hate crimes and hate organizing. I especially want to thank Paula Freelander and also Paula and Alfred Freelander Forum for offering this opportunity for me to speak with you all today. It is such a critical time in our country. And before I go into my long talk, I just want to say something, just in case everything else gets lost. This is the most important piece, that we are in a moment right now where we are witnessing the unfolding of a 21st century civil rights movement. It is a movement that is full of power, full of magic and excitement. But a movement takes stewardship and it takes tending. We also know that civil rights movements are messy. Some of us listening tonight are old enough to remember the 1960 civil rights movement. And when we speak to those who have experience, they can share story after story about how things weren't so neat. And we'll get into some of those. Moving the myths to the realities and the nuances of this moment are critically important. But mostly in that building of the 21st century civil rights movement, I want you to know that much of the horror and the intensity of the moment we are facing, we're actually facing because we have been successful at moving what John Lewis, one of the iconic civil rights leaders who passed away recently, framed as moving the United States from the aspiration of an inclusive democracy, people-centered, transparent, and accountable, to its reality. That is the role of this moment, and all that we can ask of one another is that we stand for our values, we stand for our neighbors, and we stand for the future of those who come after us. We do that by choosing to do one thing, and that's where the story starts tonight. We are all familiar with the events that took place on Wednesday, January 6th in DC, where individuals gathered for a rally to oppose the election count that is largely symbolic, but is an important part of the transitionary nature of American democracy. It has taken place for hundreds of years. This rally turned into an insurrection, and I won't proffer. I have my own opinions and understandings of things that I think unfolded that day, but I will wait, right? It will become clear through investigations and through studies, all the events that transpired that day. But what we saw was significant for several reasons. The first being that at least 4, if not 5 individuals were killed that day, including a law enforcement officer who was crushed purposely by protesters and insurrectionists in the doors of the Capitol building and had his head crushed in with a fire extinguisher. We also know that individuals who had participated in the protest died from medical emergencies that occurred. In addition, one individual, an insurrectionist, was shot by law enforcement officers. It was a tragic day, and it was tragic for a number of reasons. It has become very clear as events have unfolded that this was an intentional attempt to interrupt and depose American democracy, replacing it with perhaps an authoritarian rule. That there were plans in place, a conspiracy, if you will, to overtake the Capitol and to perhaps harm, if not at least hold hostage, Congress members. We also know at this moment that there was a significant failure by our democratic institutions and civil servants, including law enforcement and elected officials, who chose instead to lean into ideology rather than the rule of law. These were the events that took place on January 6th. Within that crowd of insurrectionists were a number of tendencies. White nationalists who believe in an all-white ethno-state through ethnic cleansing of people of color and Jews. We know that there were paramilitary organizations, including the 3 Percenters, who named themselves thus because they believe only 3% of America, of pre-colonial America, supported the American Revolution, and that they only need 3% of the American population in order to overthrow the current US government. There were also Oath Keepers, members of a group who were made up of law enforcement officers and formerly and retired, officers of the US military. In addition, there were more loose paramilitary formations such as Boogaloo Boys, who individuals were responsible for the murders of law enforcement officers last year in Northern California, and the attempted arson and bombing of a police headquarters in Minneapolis. The tendencies were quite broad. And so I don't want us to draw a lot of conclusions about who or what was on the streets. But there are things we should know. That January 6th signified an alignment of authoritarians in this country who may have different end goals, but were all committed to overthrowing American democracy. The other piece that we should keep in mind is that the events of January 6th very well may have simply been a dry run. Today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Foreign Intelligence, and other law enforcement have warned that the coming days may find America facing a level of political violence that it is unfamiliar with in the modern era, that there is so much concern that the National Guard has now been mobilized, and that it will not only be Washington, D.C., but state capitals, primarily in blue states around the country, that paramilitary groups and other insurrectionists have stated that they will target. People used to accuse me of hyperbole when I talked about these things. I think we can dispense with that. What do I think is likely to happen in the coming days as we approach the inauguration is pretty much based off what we have already witnessed by insurrectionists. And it didn't start in January. It started long before, in the months and the years leading up to January 6th. Here in Portland, Oregon, we have witnessed not only racial justice protests under the banner of Black Lives Matters, but repeated incursions over the last 4 years by far-right formations, including the Proud Boys, who were also in DC. The Proud Boys frame themselves as simply Western chauvinists. They claim that they are not anti-racist, that they are not racist, nor are they aligned with white nationalists. Yet the group over the last 4 years has shown a quite close relationship with white nationalists, including in rhetoric and including individuals that they have associated with. The Proud Boys have led several levels of political violence here in Oregon. The beating of Black Lives Matters protesters, the use of weapons and explosives in some of these organized protests. What we at Western State Center and Southern Poverty Law Center anticipate moving forward are simply this, that we take this movement at its word. When it says that it will gather in DC, we believe that is true because it has gathered in other places around the country when it has said it would do so. We are clear that it is a movement that has articulated and utilized political violence, and we believe that it will do so again. We believe that that political violence could be at a significant scale. As we all know, in Washington, D.C., there was a truck that was confiscated that was filled with long rifles and the materials that could be used in the making of explosives. It is also clear that at least 4 explosive devices that had timers and were armed were placed at the Republican headquarters and also the Democratic headquarters in Washington, D.C. This is not to instill fear. This is to be very clear that we are in a moment in our time when democracy is under risk. But where did this all come from? And how did we get to this moment? Every story has an origin. And the origins of what we saw in DC actually begin in the mid-1960s. There was this thing that you all might be familiar with called the 1960 Civil Rights Movement. We're familiar with the names Martin Luther King, Rabbi Herschel, and Miss Parks. These were all characters within a larger narrative in the struggle for equality in the United States. And I want to talk about this 1960 civil rights movement because it helps us understand the importance of the arc of social movements. Many point to the origins of the white nationalist movement in the era of Charlottesville 3 years ago, where neo-Nazis and other alt-right members took to the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, where they marched on and attempted to march on a Jewish synagogue, and committed acts of violence that ended up in the murder of a civil rights activist by the name of Heather Heyer. The white nationalist movement actually has its origins in the victories of the 1960 civil rights movement. Let me explain for a second. To understand white nationalism, which I argue is a social movement and distinct from white supremacy, I want to talk about white supremacy for a second. White supremacy is both a historic and present-day system that was built upon the idea of white superiority, the belief that white people, just because of their makeup, right, the color of their skin, were superior in every way and had an ordained given right from God, right, to rule and dominate in society. This is how society was structured in the United States, and it was the core idea of the founding of the United States. White supremacy was made up off of three specific pillars of white superiority. The first was the stolen lands and genocide of Native people. The second was a system of chattel slavery, the enslavement of Black people under a system of slavery that was like no other that had existed previous to it. It was not like just slavery. It was about the stripping away of humans to make them chattel, right? No different than cows or cattle in the field. That meant people were brought from specific cultures, languages, religions, and historic backgrounds and forced and melded together into one peoplehood. Different ethnic and religious groups of Africans were brought through a system of chattel slavery and morphed into what we know today as Black America, stripped of language, stripped of culture, forced to work generationally, right, in a process of slavery that by all accounts was historically brutal and draconian, and which we still face the impacts today. But it wasn't just the genocide of Native people and the theft of their lands. It wasn't just chattel slavery. It was also the control of women in society, misogyny, the control of sexuality. It is these three things that allowed the United States to organize itself into a powerful political and economic country that it is today. Now, I want everyone to take a deep breath because that's a lot of information and it's heavy information. I want to tell everyone listening something. None of us are responsible for the creation or how the United States of America was created. None of us were there. None of us thought it up. In many ways, all of us are victims on one level from the creation of a society that was built on exclusion. And we should take pride in another point, that despite that narrative and society and process of exclusion, many in the United States have resisted that in very resilient ways, moving the country more steadily onto the path of democracy. But here we have this system of white supremacy. And along comes this 1960 civil rights movement that defeats white supremacy as the rule of law. It does so through the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and also something known as the Immigration Reform Act. These were the three core pieces of the 1960 civil rights movement. But I want to note something, that the 1960s civil rights movement in actuality has most of its major victories not in the 1960s, but in the 1950s. And when you talk to historians, they will point out often that the 1960 civil rights movement has its starts actually in the 1920s and the 1930s. The civil rights movement is significant because it moves the idea of white supremacy, right, as the ultimate uncontested lens in America. The idea that white people are superior in every way, and that people of color, primarily Black and Indigenous folks, are inferior to a contested terrain where ideas of inclusion and values around inclusion and opportunity can be debated, right, and actually enforced in this country. Now imagine for a second, you are an arch segregationist. And the fact that you have to stop for a second to imagine that tells us how far we have come. But imagine you're an arch segregationist. You believe Black people are inferior in every way. But suddenly you suffer your largest political defeat against people you see as inferior. How do you make sense of that? Do you all of a sudden change your mind and think, well, I guess Black people aren't inferior after all. Well, that's not likely. People don't change their worldviews so quickly or so suddenly, particularly worldviews that have been socialized generationally. But those who lost to the civil rights advancement needed to come up with an answer. And it is in that answer that white nationalism is birthed. Let me explain. If white supremacy was grounded upon the idea of anti-Blackness, the inferiority of Black and Indigenous people, right? White nationalism grounded itself upon the idea of anti-Semitism and the hatred of Jews. Let me explain. As I said before, those who believed in segregation were never going to admit that they lost to people they saw as inferior. So they needed another scapegoat. And they borrowed from a narrative that had been developed in Europe in the early 1900s that was ultimately published in a fake document called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion purported to tell a story of Jewish elders who gathered in a cemetery at midnight to plot the destruction of European Christendom, as the story is told, and that they sought to do so by taking control of the finance system, by taking control of cultural institutions, and by taking control of government through the expansion of an idea called democracy. The protocols were developed and disseminated by Russian police, secret police, primarily in France at a time that democracy was taking root. You see, Russian czarists were concerned about the spread of democracy. It was a narrative that was very powerful, and people began to adopt it. At a time of great change, it was a convenient conspiracy that simplified the complexities that people were facing in society. And it allowed them to take their fears and their anxieties and to place them on a community that had already been positioned as a nefarious other. Again, if white supremacy was built upon racism, white nationalism, right, the idea that the civil rights movement had dispossessed white people, was grounded upon the idea of anti-Semitism. For those white nationalists, those art segregationists, it allowed them to place blame on someone for this loss. And it allowed them to maintain the idea of white superiority. For you see, Black people could have never self-organized. They must have merely been puppets on the strings of a puppet master. It is why that I argue that anti-Semitism isn't at the core of white nationalism. It is the core of white nationalism. It is so central to white nationalism that Black people and other marginalized groups will never win our freedom if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot anti-Jewish hate. Amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role they have always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils and the driving force behind white dispossession. At the foundation of the modern day movement is the explicit claim that Jews are a separate race. For you see, anti-Semitism is not merely a religious form of bigotry. It is a racialized bigotry that places Jews as a racialized other. Their ostensible position as white, right, in America, white nationalist places the greatest trick the devil has ever played. In fact, Jews, despite and indeed because of the fact that they are often seen as white, are an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated in the eyes of the white nationalist movement. This fantasy of invisible Jewish power explains how Black Americans, a race of supposed inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, how feminists in the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, and how immigrant workers could mount a successful challenge to economic inequality. For every advance in civil rights or economic justice in this country, white nationalists position Jews to be the blame, the nefarious power. It is my belief that when folks ask me where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement and the alt-right, it's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using language that traces all the way back to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. And it is language that is intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. Such rabid anti-Semitism is the framework in which the entire movement functions. I have spent the last 4 years working with civil and human rights organizations to understand that to refuse to deal with any ideology of domination is to abet it, and that fighting anti-Semitism cuts off the animating force of white nationalism for the sake of all marginalized communities. We often conflate white nationalism with white supremacy. But what I want to tell you here in closing, before we go to questions, is simply this. We should not conflate the two. White supremacy is a system that is built upon anti-Blackness. White nationalism is a social movement that is growing on the bedrock of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism does not originate from the white nationalist movement. Indeed, hate groups do not bring anti-Semitism into our communities. It simply organizes the anti-Semitism that already exists. If we are to successfully confront insurrectionists who attempt to try to overthrow US democracy, we first have to contend with the question of anti-Semitism. This is difficult to do for several reasons that I want to address really quickly. The first is, despite our understanding, anti-Semitism is a relatively new conversation in the United States. And it is a relatively new conversation within racial justice and human rights movements in this country. It is important that we open up and expand the conversation within those movements. For you see, as I said before, anti-Semitism is not a right-wing phenomenon, but neither is it a left-wing phenomenon. Anti-Semitism is an American phenomenon in which social movements tap into to build power at certain times. Why the targeting and scapegoating of the Jewish community? Because it is a small community. As my friend and colleague and mentor Deborah Lipstadt often says, it's much harder to organize people, right, to discriminate against folks who are left-handed. Why? Because all of us know people who are left-handed. I'm left-handed. Building a fear and anxiety around the othering of left-handed people is simply hard. But a small community like the Jewish community makes a convenient scapegoat. When we see anti-Semitism functioning within communities of color, such as the rash of killings and beatings that we witnessed in the East Coast over a year ago, we should understand that anti-Semitism isn't more of a problem in the Black community. It is a fact that anti-Semitism is sadly expressing itself in the way that it was designed to do. For you see, anti-Semitism is not merely a set of behaviors, right, or a set of stereotypes. It is an ideology. It is a system of bigotry that functions, right, to place Jews as a buffer between the haves and the have-nots in a society, to allow, right, the have-nots to have an escape valve by being able to blame a small population. This is why racist anti-Semitic tropes are in play each and every day in America. The idea that Jews control all the wealth or Jews control all of the media. These are longtime tropes that play out as release valves for the anxiety of those who have not in our society. How do we counter this? I think that we start by honestly opening up the debate on anti-Semitism. We need space for people to grow their muscles, right? To be able to talk about anti-Semitism And we know no one learns to run without first learning how to crawl and fall. We need to open up space that makes people not afraid, right, to wrestle with their anti-Semitism, but to understand that it is important in building a 21st century civil rights movement. I'll end with this. We should understand that left unchecked in American society, that anti-Semitism provides the fuel for conspiratorial thinking. We are all now familiar with the events that happened in Charlottesville 3 years ago, where the alt-right marched down the streets saying Jews will not replace us. I hope the conversation that I framed today helps place that chant into context. I hope that we also understand that as we watch the rise of mission-oriented hate crimes in this country, whether they are African Americans being targeted in Charleston, South Carolina, or Sikhs being targeted through mission-oriented hate crimes in Wisconsin, or the targeting of Latinos in El Paso, or the targeting of Jews in Pittsburgh or Poway, that they have one thing in common. Despite the anti-Jewish bigotry in Pittsburgh, the anti-Black racism in Charlottesville, the anti-Muslim bigotry that was used to target Sikhs in Wisconsin, or the anti-Latino racism in El Paso, that what unified these killers were their hatred of the Jewish community. What unified them was the belief that they were at war with the Jewish community. Indeed, what all of these mission-oriented hate crimes had in common was that they were each driven by anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is much more rampant than we allow space for in our society. It manifests itself each and every day. But we have been positioned in such partisan ways that we only come to understand anti-Semitism as a tool to wield as a weapon against our political opponents. We need to resist this. Anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Semitism is a value-based proposition. And we should be no concerned about whether it manifests on the left or right. We should be concerned that it is manifesting in our society. And that left unchecked, it does not only put the Jewish community at risk, but also communities of color and our democracy itself. It is the oxygen upon which the white nationalist movement is building its political power in America, but it's also in the air that we breathe. The way that we start is opening up a debate, allowing people to build muscles, allowing ourselves to build the type of alliance that we need to take on racism in the society. And we do that by making space for racialized forms of anti-Semitism to be considered as part of the racial justice movement. I want to thank you for your time. I want to open up the space for questions and moderation, but I want to encourage you all to speak out against anti-Semitism, but to speak out to open up space for conversation rather than shutting the conversation down and allowing anti-Semitism to continue to percolate in the shadows. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. We've gotten some really good questions, and I want to go back to something you just said. You make a fabulous case for fighting anti-Semitism. You talk about speaking out and having a discussion about anti-Semitism, but a lot of people don't think that anti-Semitism is as pervasive as you say. And one of the questions we got was, where have you seen success in helping friends and neighbors understand the truths you are preaching? It seems so clear to me and so hidden to others. How do we make people understand how pervasive anti-Semitism is and how it informs other types of hatred?
You know, it's hard to believe. I mean, we are all here talking about anti-Semitism tonight. But Dina, you know, as part of the Anti-Defamation League, you know better than most. 4 years ago, right, it was hard to have anyone want to talk about anti-Semitism inside the United States. And organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and my organization and many others have worked really diligently over the last 4 years I can tell you, if you Google anti-Semitism and United States, look and then click the news tab, look at the level of reporting on anti-Semitism in this country. Look at how many people in the left, right, where I reside. I like to tell people I am of the political left, right? But ideology doesn't, I don't need ideology to tell me how to understand my values in life, right? My values are more important than my ideology. And I hope that's the same for folks who are listening today. But here within kind of the racial justice left, within kind of more multiracial spaces, I am watching anti-Semitism be debated in ways that it has never been debated in my lifetime, right? I didn't go into the origins of how I came to understand the importance of anti-Semitism. We may do that a little bit later. But I want to tell folks, without a doubt, there is a broad debate happening on anti-Semitism. The problem is it's not happening in all the ways that we like, right? But that makes sense in the beginning of a conversation. Folks don't know the right words. Folks don't have an understanding historically, right? And we know people feel defensive. And when people feel defensive, right, they reinforce bad positions. So I want to tell you, within kind of the human rights, civil rights culture, absolutely anti-Semitism is being discussed in really significant ways. At the national level, the fact that the special US envoy position on anti-Semitism is being turned into an ambassadorship tells us the level of importance that this conversation is having at a governance level. Increasingly, too, around the country, I'm starting to see, right, spaces that are being built out where Jews are no longer just considered kind of a white ally, but as having a stake, right, in the fight against racism in this country, which I think is real. So it is happening in really positive ways. And, I'll say it's also happening in really negative ways. For folks who saw the shirts around Auschwitz, right, that appeared in DC, right, that was a message. In previous protests of the alt-right, right, 6 million wasn't enough t-shirts and sweaters were being founded. But also there's this thing called QAnon, which folks may be familiar with. It is a growing conspiracy, right, that tells the story, right, that Donald Trump is having a secret battle against pedophiles, right, and those who seek to exploit children and to sacrifice children. We should all understand that that entire narrative of QAnon comes directly out of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. QAnon is basically blood libel light. The idea that Jewish, that Jewish leaders, right, are secretly sacrificing white Christian children. This is the basis of QAnon, but it's hard to understand QAnon if one does not have a grounding in anti-Semitism. How does one respond to a phenomena without actually understanding the phenomena? So we have to push people to tackle and wrestle with anti-Semitism, right? Not because, well, it'd be nice if folks treated the Jewish community well, right? I agree. But we need to take a self-interest task. We need folks to understand that if they do not take on anti-Semitism with seriousness, that they will leave themselves and their communities vulnerable to a white nationalist movement that is committed to violence.
It sounds like from what you say that institutions have made some progress in fighting anti-Semitism too. You mentioned the special envoy on anti-Semitism, but how do we work with institutions? This is part of your expertise. How do we work with institutions to fight it?
Yeah. So I think that there's a number of things that need to happen. If you're asking me my wish list, and I have a big wish list, Dina, so I'm gonna put it out there real quick. But I'm just gonna put out the top priorities. The first is, while we do a phenomenal job of tracking incidences of anti-Semitism, right? What we don't track anymore or as deeply and in a nuanced way are anti-Semitic ideas, right? And the influence of those ideas on our society. We don't really understand whether the Jewish community faces job discrimination, right? And in what ways. Part of the problem, and why I think it's important to begin gathering that data in deeper and more nuanced ways, is I don't think we have a handle on how anti-Semitism functions in the modern era. By way of comparison, in the 1920s and the 1930s in the US, Black Americans faced a significant wave of racial terror through lynchings. My own family fled, right? Shepherdsville, Kentucky, in the early 1900s after the lynching, right, of Mary Thompson, right? My family fled within a month and headed to the West Coast. Now, that wave of terror was significant. Jim Crow was significant. Numbers of African Americans were killed. I'm not calling it a genocide. What I'm saying is things like Tulsa, the individual lynchings that occurred in other places, the race riots targeting Black people were horrifying in the United States. And Jim Crow made it even worse, those systems of description. But imagine for a second that I tried to only understand the impact of anti-Black racism today through the lens of the early 1900s in the United States. We would say that we have fallen short because we would all agree that racism has changed and evolved, right, over that time. In the same way, the anti-Semitism of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s may not be the same anti-Semitism that functions today. And we need a deeper understanding of how that anti-Semitism functions in culture, in politics, and in economy. So that's my first wish. My second wish is that we open our doors to, I am not Jewish, right? And the reason I have such a little bit of a grounding, I'm not going to call myself an expert on anti-Semitism, is because I came up at a time in hate crime work, right, where those who are doing anti-hate work were bonded, right? Jewish institutions who may have seen me as some kind of like leftist radical still felt it was important to be in conversation with me, right? To help me try to understand this aspect and to be able to disagree with me. There was lots of courageous and principled disagreement that happened, but that leaning in, right, meant that I had a chance to deepen my knowledge around an important issue that I think is now showing itself to be quite valuable, right? That investment by groups and individuals within the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, congregations around the country back in the late 80s and early 90s is paying off today in helping our own social movements understand anti-Semitism. We have to lean in. We cannot silo ourselves. What I tell folks doing racial justice work is that you cannot fight racism without experiencing racism. And I'm not saying that's fair. I'm just stating a fact, right? You cannot lean into an issue and then act as if you're not going to experience it, right? In the same way, you cannot fight anti-Semitism without a willingness to experience that anti-Semitism. People make mistakes. I'm not talking about the Louis Farrakhan's and the David Dukes. What I'm talking about are people who are struggling around an issue that they are unfamiliar with, particularly marginalized communities in the Black community, Latino, immigrant communities, Muslim communities, who have not had access, right, to the quality education that many white students experience, access to museums. We need to lean into those communities because they are the communities who are most vulnerable, right, to our systems of anti-Semitism that exist in the United States. The last is this. See, you knew this was going to be a long question. The third is this. We absolutely have to hold our elected officials accountable, right, when they express anti-Semitism. Now, I will argue, we can get into this in a little bit more in the question and answer, that our responses to elected officials who have expressed anti-Semitism, right, have been uneven, right? And they're uneven because one can both be the victim of one form of discrimination and perpetuate another, right? So people of color, right, who can be the victims of racism can actually express anti-Semitism. That makes sense, right? They're not immune from it just because they experience a form of bigotry. And in the same way, some of the ways that we respond to these anti-Semitic statements, right, sometimes missteps, sometimes not, can sometimes be biased by our own racism, right, our own xenophobias. And so we all have to challenge ourselves to lean in a little bit more strongly and to make sure we are giving equitable responses across the line. But we have to hold elected officials accountable, right? We have to make sure that they understand that they cannot defend democracy unless they are also strong around fighting anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism at its core, right, seeks to weaken belief in democracy by inputting, right, a conspiracy theory.
I want to go back to something you said about how these movements, or these, not, I guess movement's not the right word, but these types of ideologies or prejudices have changed over the years. And one of the things that I think, and you talked about marginalized communities who may not be getting certain information. One of the biggest things I think we're fighting in this country right now is disinformation.
Yes.
And certainly anti-Semitism and often racism and other types of hatred are built on disinformation. How do we fight that? Information moves so fast these days. And without all of the talk about fake news and what's true and what's not true, nobody knowing what's true and what's not true, how do we fight that disinformation so that when we do talk to each other, we believe each other?
Yes. Well, it comes from, you know, we are in a society. This is, I just want to say real quick, this is me offering an opinion right now. So I just want to be clear. So this is an opinion. My opinion is that we have become a highly politicized society. That may not be a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we have become politicized to a point, right, that our ideologies have become another form of faith, right? And we first try to understand the world now through our ideologies, which are imperfect by, you know, they are contradictory. I don't care what anyone's political ideology is, including my own. They're imperfect, right? They are contradictory at points, and we adapt them typically to respond to certain moments in time. Our ideologies do not take the place of our values, but we have reached a point in history in our country where we check our values first against our ideology, and then we adjust our values, right, based off of where our ideology is. That is the world turned upside down. The fact of the matter is I may have a different ideology than 80% of the folks listening to us right now, right? I said earlier on, I'm politically left. I didn't say I was a liberal, right? I said I am on the political left, right? I say that for a reason. I guarantee you that while my ideology may be different than 80% of the folks on this call, I bet we have a lot of values in common despite the differences in our ideology. I bet many of us care about hard work. I bet many of us care about safe communities. I bet many of us care about the future of our children and younger people. I bet we care about honesty. I bet we care about our country, right? Caring is a value, right? Abundance is a value. Safety is a value. If I allow my ideology to interfere with sitting down with other folks, right, around values we have in common, I am sacrificing the common good, right? I am putting the interest of my community, of my country, secondary, right, to my own individual belief. somehow we have gotten to a place in this country where we allow each other to do that, and we have to break that. And the way we break that is by starting to talk about what values we have in common, right? And talking with one another honestly to try to get to a point to understand if we at least agree on what the problems are. I'm leaving aside the solutions for a second. Let's just first start trying to figure out if we can find agreement on problems that we face in society. If we can find the alignment on problems, I actually think based off values, we can actually seek solutions. But we have to let go of the idol of ideology in this moment. It is pulling our country down. And in fact, it's pulling the world down.
You just really answered a question that came in from one of the people listening. Any suggestions for listening to others with opposing views while also honoring one's own principles? So we
That's
start
right.
with trying to solve problems based on our values. We have a lot of educators who are
Wonderful.
listening to you. And we've gotten a couple of questions about children, talking to children, protecting children. One of the questions is, many Jewish teens face issues of identity, particularly in this time of anti-Semitism and nationalism. How can we as educators and lay leaders inspire young Jewish kids to embrace their identity with courage?
Yes. Well, I saw something about 5 years ago that I spoke to. I was a program officer at the Ford Foundation, and I about 5 or 6 years ago, I had the honor of being approached by a group of young Jewish leaders from around the country who had an idea. They wanted to pull together a meeting of Jews of color, young Jews of color, right? And it was not ideological, right? They just wanted to come into a space together. And you know what? They couldn't find a lot of funding to do that gathering. And I was really proud at the Ford Foundation that we were able to kind of support that convening. What was important about that is what I had seen in other spaces, right? With wonderful rabbis and cantors, right? And others. I saw what I believe is a renaissance that is occurring within the Jewish community, right? And it's happening amongst young people in really kind of vibrant ways, perhaps not in ways that we as older folks might like, right? Or might do, but in ways that are important to that generation. We have to feed that cultural renaissance, both Jews and non-Jews. We have to create space for that, because it is that cultural renaissance, right, that allows a younger generation to kind of steel itself, right, for the kind of struggles and battles that are happening in that moment. I've often argued in the Black community that nearly every Black cultural renaissance parallels, right, a time when the Black community feels most threatened, right, and is most under attack. Why? It's a way that we fortify ourselves. I say invest in that. The other is to open up space for young Jewish leaders to really explore, and particularly these young Jewish leaders of color who are coming up within the Jewish community play such an important role, right? I watch day after day, week after week, month after month, right? Jews who are also Black, right? Who are every day pushing back against anti-Semitism, right, within the racial justice movement in ways that I simply don't have the credibility to do, and nor do folks who aren't Jewish and Black, right? And so investing in them, even if I don't agree with them on every single issue, right, is critically important. It is not their burden to take on that role, but they are forced to take on that role. And at the very least, right, we can try to fortify them. The other thing that I would just say is that we have to get into a place of reforging anew. Notice I didn't say rebuilding the old, reforging a new relationship between the Black and Jewish communities in the United States. It is critically important that we do so. Why? I will tell you as a studier of social movements and of the civil rights movement, that Black and Jewish relationships were critical to the civil rights movement and to democracy. Not in the ways that the myths often get thrown out, right? We have lots of myths about Black and Jewish relationships, but there really was a real Black and Jewish relationship that has been critical to the success of civil rights and the advancement of democracy in this society. We do not get there, right, without reforging that relationship. And I want to say this, regardless of how one may have voted or who they supported in Georgia, I think it is not without coincidence, right, that this backlash that we saw in Washington, D.C., this armed, right, insurrection, right, the attempt, right, to hold elected officials hostages happened right on the heels, right, of an election in Georgia that sent an African American and a Jewish American to the White House in the same election night, right? That symbol of Blacks and Jews advancing democracy set off a reaction that helped fuel what occurred in DC, right, the very next day. It is time for us to reconstruct a 21st century civil rights movement. And we don't do that unless we begin to have some real hard conversations. Those conversations aren't going to happen right away. So how do we approach ourselves? We approach by having a conversation on common values, and then we get to know one another by doing work together. It doesn't have to be the biggest work together. Recently, I was able to take a group of Jewish leaders down, I and other African Americans, to Montgomery, Alabama together. For 2 days, we had a chance to learn a little bit about what it looked like, right, for Black and Jewish communities in Montgomery, Alabama in the midst of the 1960s. We got to forge relationships. And when we came back, our commitment was to talk about this with other folks. It wasn't the biggest thing in the world. Not everything has to be the March on Washington. We simply have to do one thing. And when we work together, we forge relationships more quickly than when we are just sitting and talking with one another.
You're talking about everybody now, right?
I'm talking about
people of all
everyone.
ages. One of the things that I think is encouraging about our world today, at least in Houston, is that there's a lot of diversity, and students, younger people, seem to be much more comfortable with diversity than older generations are. What suggestions do you have, since again, we have so many educators here, for them to forge those relationships or help seed those relationships between young Blacks and young Jews and other people who are in this diverse atmosphere?
So here's what we know for children, and thank you for honing that in for me again as I wandered off in a macro way. Let me hone this back in. There is something in that is happening in the United States called demographic anxiety or racial anxiety, and it's a pretty natural state. It is when demographics begin to change in a society, people feel natural anxiety. The easiest way to kind of explain what that anxiety feels like is, imagine you walk into a room full of strangers, and we all have done that. Imagine the immediate feelings that you sense. I remember the very first time I ever walked into a Jewish house of worship, right, a synagogue. I was really nervous. I was nervous not because I was afraid of Jewish folks. I was nervous because I didn't know the culture. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know a lot of people. I was full of anxiety. Don't tell, right? And it's pretty natural. The problem is that anxiety that people are experiencing around demographic change that's happening in the United States, that folks are being told two things. They're being told by the white nationalist movement, right, that anxiety is an existential fear, right? That it's a fear that you are going to be wiped out and come join us, right, to fight against that demographic change. On the racial justice side, what people are hearing is, we don't want anything to do with you, right? Go away. This is not your future. Well, when folks are being told if they perceive they don't have a future with a multiracial America, who are they then likely going to lean into, right? The group that is telling them that there's something to do with their demographic anxiety. That is what is happening to an older generation of Americans right now. And I could give you example after example of how that demographic anxiety is being exploited. But I want to talk about young people for a second. That demographic anxiety also exists, but there's a lesson here. Why is that demographic anxiety not as impactful? Because there's something called demographic intimacy or racial intimacy. What we know from study after study is that that anxiety can be managed by putting a person back into that experience multiple times. Do I still feel the same anxiety that I felt the first time I walked into a Jewish house of worship? If I can be honest and lean in courageously, I suspect that I feel the same anxiety, right? The difference is I have now been in somewhere around, I don't know, probably 100 houses of worship, and I hope it's 300, right, in the end of a year. That I now know how to manage that anxiety, right? To keep it in context in a way that it has very little impact on my life. I find it kind of a curious thing, right? Rather than a threatening thing. Young people, the more that they are placed into that demographic intimacy, will gain the skills to manage that anxiety, not just amongst themselves, right? But their parents and the older generation as well. Right? The younger generation is proof that a multiracial inclusive democracy can actually work. But I want to give some concrete examples of how you build that intimacy. It's not just through workshops or presentations like this. It is why the arts are so critically important. It's why sports are so critically important. It's why social service clubs, right, in schools are critically important. It's why desegregation in transportation, in housing, and employment is so critically important. Why? Because that is how young people come and cross paths with one another. It's how they get to know one another. So what I tell folks is if we as adults really want to help young people, we need to rise to the challenge of tackling segregation, right, in our communities and our societies once for all. Segregation works to the advantage of white nationalists. And I'm going to end this question with a story. About, I'm going to say now 4 years ago, there was an alt-right demonstration here in Portland, Oregon, outside of a blues festival. And why outside of a blues festival? Well, because white nationalists know how to organize just like we do. And they knew there'd be a lot of people going in and out, right? And they knew that there would be media there, right? And they knew it would be visual. There was a young white nationalist activist who might have been alt-right. I don't know if he was white nationalist, so I don't want to other this person. There was an alt-right young activist who got cornered by this guy with a video camera. We know that guy. We've seen him in events all the time, right? And he was just yelling at this alt-right activist, this young kid. Why are you here? Why are you here? No one wants you here. The mayor doesn't want you here. All of these protesters don't want you in our city. Why are you here? And this young alt-right activist said something, right? Clearly he had practiced it, but it was quite profound. That speaks to this issue. He looked at this guy with the camera and he said, yeah, I've heard you don't want us here in Portland. But the fact of the matter is that Portland is an urban area that is losing its Black population by both percentage and whole number. He went on to say, you can say you don't want us here, but you are doing something we could never get away with. You are actually literally disappearing the Black population of Portland, Oregon, right? That was his response to us. In short, he was calling us hypocrites. What I take from that, and what you should take from that, is that we do not defeat these forces of bigotry, these insurrectionist white nationalists, unless we deal with the underlying issues of segregation that allow them to believe, right, that we are hypocrites and that we cannot manage a multiracial society. We have to prove the case to the next generation that a multiracial America works. Why? Because I like for folks to remember is as far as we have come, we should know, right, that democracies, right, are quite delicate flowers. How delicate? Well, we only need to look to last Wednesday to understand how much stewardship a democracy requires. And we simply don't get that unless we help our society understand that the future is not a race war. It's not a civil war that the white nationalist movement is putting out. The future is already here. And if we choose, it is an abundant and creative future for the next generation. And we all get to be the stewards that open up the gate. While we may not be the generation that gets to see the promised land, right? We are the generation that gets to help everyone get over the mountaintop and down the other side. This is our role. When I was a kid, we used to play a game called If I Were. And If I Were was us just sitting in a circle. And we'd say things like, if I were driving down the freeway, well, we were much too young to drive, but if we were driving down the freeway and the brakes went out, here's what I would do. And we'd argue with, about what we would or wouldn't do. The one question that would come up every summer that I always tell folks is, if I were in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, here is what I would do. Now, we were kids full of bravado. We didn't understand Jim Crow. We didn't understand what our parents and grandparents had to put up with each and every day. It was beyond us. We had moved past that, right? So we were full of ourselves about what we would or wouldn't put up with and how we would or wouldn't respond. That question has haunted me, right, for like 40 something years, right? What would I have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement? How would I have stood up for myself? Well, there's something I got to tell everyone. I don't have to wonder the answer to that question anymore. And neither does anyone else listening to me right now. The truth is, whatever it is I would have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, whatever it is you would have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, is the same thing you do when you get off of this presentation today. I want to tell everyone, make it count. History will judge us. This is our chance to prove, right, that we all know how to stand. Those of us who believe in tolerance, those of us who believe in prosperity, those of us who believe in community health. We have a generation that came before us that has brought us to this point. The horrors that we are facing right now are a reaction to those successes. It is not our job to hide in closets right now. It is not our job to silo. It is our job to come together and move forward as a single country to embrace the aspirations that we know that this country can be. This is our time. And so we should act. We should make it count. Just do one thing.
What a hopeful note to end on. It's up to each and every one of us together to honor what happened in the civil rights movement and the successes that came and to move those forward. So I'm going to turn it back over to David Scott. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dina.
Great.
Thank you.
I hope everyone joins the ADL in the Southwest region. I hope everyone joins the Social Justice Committee there at Congregation Beth Israel. Be an organization right now. Be with one another. Do not allow the fear of this moment to isolate us from one another.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Eric Ward. Thank you, Dina Marks. To Paula Friedlander, thank you. And thanks to each of you for joining us this evening. There's so much to consider and to reflect on from tonight's program. And we pray for greater understanding and a willingness to listen to each other. We look forward to welcoming you this Thursday evening at 7 o'clock as Dr. Ed Septimus will lead a program entitled Turning the Corner on COVID-19, the